Welcome to Paals. It's Prof Anyanwu's anatomy lecture series. In this place, our goal is to make anatomy simple. If you're just joining us or you have not subscribed, we would like you to please do and be part of this amazing anatomy family. We have been discussing the gross anatomy of the heart, and in our previous lecture, we've looked at the components of the standard features of the heart. We talked about the surfaces, the borders, the apex. We looked at the base, the groove, the sulci, and we also considered the right atrial chamber. Now we will look at the rest of the chambers in this lecture. In this part 2 you're watching, we'll consider the rest of the chambers, which are the left atrial and right and left ventricular chambers. Part 3 will be on arterial blood supply to the heart and also some clinical correlates. No time to waste. Let's go to class. So we'll continue with the right ventricle. Now, the right ventricle is a triangular chamber. From this view, we can see the triangular shape is already outlined in our image here. So this is a region of the right ventricle. It forms the largest part of the anterior surface. As you can notice, all the chambers that are seen in the anterior surface, it gives the highest contribution, and then it gives a small part of the diaphragmatic surface and almost the entire inferior border of the heart. Now, this chamber lies to the left of the right atrium. Here is a right atrium, and then we can see the right ventricle lying to its left. Now we see this groove, the coronary sulcus, separating both chambers. Now this groove is usually filled with fat. We can see some fat particles within the groove, the atrioventricular groove, but the major occupant of this groove is the structure called the right coronary artery. This is a right coronary artery that is lodged in the right coronary sulcus. So the right ventricle will narrow as it passes superiorly to form a conical part that is called the conus arteriosus or infundibulum. This conical upper part here is the part I'm marking on is a part of the right ventricle that is called the conus arteriosus or infundibulum. This part is the part that leads to the pulmonary trunk, and here is the pulmonary trunk as it moves up and then divides. The walls of the interior of the cavity of the right ventricle are much thicker than those of the atrium. Now we have three walls. We have the anterior, we have the inferior, and then we have the septal walls. Now the inferior wall is also known as the floor, and it forms the interventricular wall of both ventricles. Now let's look at the walls. So here in this picture, the wall that has been removed, so we can see the interior of this part is called the anterior wall. This little edge of the anterior wall, the part that's been cut out, so we can see the chamber of the right ventricle. Now here is the septal wall. Here is the septal wall, and then here is the inferior wall, which is actually a little part of the diaphragmatic surface of the heart. We will now consider the orifices of the right ventricle. The interior of the right ventricle has two orifices. One here is the right atrioventricular or tricuspid orifice. That is the one we are seeing here. That is the orifice here. That's the orifice here. And then the other is the pulmonary orifice. That is the one here. One is serving as an inflow part, while the other one is serving as the outflow part. These orifices are guarded by a valve. In this atrioventricular orifice, it is guarded by a valve that is called tricuspid valve. Here in the pulmonary orifice, it is guarded by a valve that is called the pulmonary valve. In this section, we look at the parts of the ventricle. There are two main parts to the interior of the right ventricle. The first part is the part that's called the inflowing part, and the second part is the outflowing part. Now, these are the two parts. We see the inflowing part is the part through which blood enters the right chamber of the ventricle, and then this is the inflow part. Here is the inflow part. Now, the outflow part is the part through which blood leaves the right ventricle, and this is the area of the outflow part. So, inflow part, and here is outflow part. The two parts are separated by a muscular ridge. Here is a muscular ridge. Here is a muscular ridge, and the name of this muscular ridge is supraventricular crest or infundibuloventricular crest. That's the spelling, supraventricular crest or infundibuloventricular crest. This crest is located between the tricuspid opening here and the pulmonary opening here. We will next consider the inflowing part. This region here is the inflowing part, the area I just marked. Please ignore the blue part. The area I just marked is the inflow part. This is the rough part of the interior of the right ventricle. As you can notice, the rough areas. Now, the rough appearance is due to the presence of series of muscular ridges. You can see the muscle ridges at the floor of this region, and these muscular ridges are called the trabecular canal. This part of the right ventricle develops from the proximal portion of the bulbous cordis of the heart tube. This inflow part of the ventricle receives blood from the right atrium through the right atrioventricular opening or tricuspid opening. That is the opening we're looking at here. Now look at the outflow part. The area marked by the blue line is the outflow part. The yellow part is the inflow part. We just talked about it. In this outflow part, the first thing that is very clear about it is that it has a smooth surface. It is the upper conical part of the right ventricle, and this part of the cavity will connect the right ventricle to the pulmonary trunk. It is a region that we said is called the conus arteriosus or the infundibulum. Where does this part develop from? It also develops from the bulbus cordis, this time the mid portion of the bulbus cordis. When we are discussing the floor of the inflow part, we talked about the rough areas and then the muscle ridges that are found here that are called the trabecular canal. We're going to consider it in this section. So what are the trabecular canal? They are the muscular ridges in the walls of the inflowing part of the right ventricle. And we can see those ridges here. We can see the ridges in all these places. These are the ridges. Now, they have three ways we can find this trabecular canal. They are either found attached to the ventricular walls throughout their whole length. In this case, the former we call ridges. Or they can be found attached at both ends. In this case, the former we call the bridges. Or they can be found having only one end attached to the ventricular surface, in which case we say they are deformed pillars. We are going to locate all of them in the next sections. Now we start with the pillars. Now the structures that are attaching one end to the wall and then one end away from the wall, we said are called pillars. Now these pillars are the structures we know that are called papillary muscles. So these are some of the papillary muscles. These are some of the structures. One end is attached to the ventricular wall and then one end is standing up. The other end of the papillary muscles are attached to the free edge of the cusps of the tricuspid valve. So let's see them here. Now these are the other ends of the papillary muscle, and we can see that they are attached to these tendons These tendons will eventually attach to the valves that are regulating the movement into and out of the tricuspid orifice. So these tendons are called the cauda tendinae. So the lower part of the papillary muscles are attached to the ventricular floor or wall, while the upper ends are attached to the leaflets of the tricuspid opening via the cauda tendinae. We noted a particular trabecular canal that attached from one end of the wall to another end of the wall. This is actually a special type of trabecular canal, and this trabecular canal is called the septomarginal trabeculae. It's also referred to as the moderator band. So here is the septomarginal trabeculae. So this is one end, from one end of the wall to another end of the wall. So it forms a bridge between the other portions of the interventricular septum. Here is the interventricular septum, and here is the anterior wall. This is the anterior wall. So it makes a connection between these two walls, forming this bridge we are seeing here. So this is the septomarginal trabeculae. The septomarginal trabeculum carries a portion of the cardiac conduction system, which is the right atrioventricular bundle, and it passes this to the anterior wall of the right ventricle. We will consider the papillary muscles in details. There are 3 of them, and they are named based on the point of origin on the ventricular surface. Earlier on, we talked about that the interior of the cavity of the right ventricle has the anterior wall, it has the inferior wall, it has the septal wall. So we also have these papillary muscles rising from the walls, and we have 3 categories of them. We have the anterior, the posterior, and the septal. The first image we have here is a chamber of the left ventricle, but I have the papillary muscles very clearly showing. These are the papillary muscles, and then these are the cauda tendinae, and then these are the leaflets. Now we'll come to the next chamber, which is actually from the right ventricle. Here is the septomarginal trabecula, here is the anterior papillary muscles, and here we have the septal and then the inferior papillary muscles. The anterior papillary muscle is the largest and most constant papillary muscle. As you can see it here, very large and most constant. And then we see that the septal papillary muscle is the most inconsistent. We can see the septal there, most inconsistent, and it's been either small or absent, with cauda tendinae emerging directly from the septal wall. You can see the cauda tendinae almost starting from the septal wall, and then the posterior or inferior papillary muscle, which is here, may consist of 1 or 2 or 3 structures with some cauda tendinae arising directly from the ventricular wall. You can see some of them, the cauda tendinae is almost coming as close as the wall, and then we are seeing the sections that are forming the papillary muscles. So here our take home here is we have the most consistent, which is the anterior papillary muscle, and then the most inconsistent, which is the septal, and then we have the posterior or inferior, which is here. We'll be looking at the cusps of the tricuspid orifice. The naming of the 3 cups is based on their relative position in the right ventricle. Now, here is the right atrium, and here is the right ventricle. And then this is the tricuspid orifice, and then the structure I'm running my light on now are the valves. And because there are 3, we call them the tricuspid valve or atrioventricular valves. So we have the anterior, we have the septal, and we have the posterior cusps. If we take another view, from this view, we can see all the valves in the heart. Here we have the 3 cusps, the tricuspid. Now, in the left part, this is the bicuspid, and then here we're having the pulmonary, and then the aorta. We will next consider the other opening, which is the pulmonary opening, and then the valve, which is the pulmonary valve. In this illustration, this is the right ventricular chamber, and here is the opening to the pulmonary trunk. So here is the pulmonary valve. Now let's also locate this in this other diagram. Here we are seeing the inflow part, the tricuspid, and then when we move up, we're moving to the outflow part, and these are the pulmonary valves. So we have the pulmonary valve guarding the opening of the outflow tract to the pulmonary trunk. This is at the apex of the infundibulum. Remember, this part is the part that's called the infundibulum. As we move up, it continues as the pulmonary trunk. Now, this pulmonary valve is made up of 3 cusps. Here again, a section of the conus arteriosus and its continuation with the pulmonary trunk. Here, it's been slit open, and we can see the 3 cusps that guard this opening. Now, for each cusp, we will see a free superior edge, and in this edge, we see a mid-thickened portion, which is called the nodule. So let's take example. This is one of the cusps. Now, this is the free upper edge. Now, in the middle part of this free upper edge, we see this thickened part. This thickened part is the part we call the nodule, and then at each side of this nodule, we see other points that we call the lunule. So we have the nodule at the midpoint, and then the lunule at the sides. The cups are named the left, the right, and the anterior, and this is relative to their fetal position. Each of these cusps will form a pocket-like sinus or pouch, and this sinus or pouch is called the pulmonary sinus. These are the pouches, the pulmonary sinuses. After ventricular contraction, the recoil of the blood fills this pulmonary sinus and will force the cusp to close. As you can notice here, by the time this is at the point blood is moving from the right ventricle to the pulmonary trunk, at the end of that phase, there will be a pulmonary recoil. At the end of this phase, with ventricular contraction, there will be recoil of blood, and this recoil of blood will fill the pulmonary sinuses, which will now force them to rest on each other and close the opening, thereby preventing blood in the pulmonary trunk from refilling the right ventricle, as you can see a section here. Now, the interventricular septum. Here is the interventricular septum. This is the septum that separates the right ventricle from the left ventricle. This is the right ventricular chamber, and here is the left ventricular chamber. So this wall is made up of a muscular part and a membranous part. This is a partition between the right and the left ventricles and forms part of the wall of both ventricular chambers. Now, the upper part of this septum, is thin and membranous, and the lower part is thick and muscular. The muscular part of this interventricular septum will form the majority of the septum, and it is about 2 or 3 times thicker than the rest part of the walls of right ventricle. It bulges into the cavity of the right ventricle. You can see the bulge. You can see the bulge here. We're now going to the left atrium. As we noted earlier, this is the left atrium. Here is the left atrium. We see it lying behind the right atrium, and it has this quadrangular shaped chamber. We have the 4 sides, the one on the here, 2, 3, and then 4-sided chamber. We say it has an auricular appendage which projects anteriorly to overlap the infundibulum of the right ventricle. We also noted that this part forms the left to third of the base of the heart. We've mentioned all this in our earlier lectures where we're introducing the base of the heart. Now this part of the heart is the part that will receive oxygenated blood from the lungs via its 4 veins, 1, 2, 3, and 4. This part will pump blood into the left ventricle, and the left atrioventricular orifice is guarded by an opening. Here is the left atrium, and here is the left ventricle. So the opening between these two chambers will be guarded by a valve called the bicuspid valve or mitral valve. We have two main walls in this chamber, the anterior wall and the posterior wall. This part of the anterior wall is a part that forms the interarterial septum. It is the part that forms the floor of the right atrium and is the part that is shared in common with the right atrium. Now the remaining part of the wall is the part that's called the posterior wall and is the part that is the inflow part, which receives the 4 pulmonary veins. We can see that most of the cavity of the left atrium is smooth-walled. Let's look at the smooth appearance of most of the cavity. It's smooth-walled, except for this part we can see here. This part, this is the auricular part. This is the auricular part of the left atrium. We can see the interior of this part is rough. So the auricular part has rough muscular ridges, and this is due to the presence of pectinate muscles. We noted this in the right atrium. This rough area of left atrium indicates part of the chamber formed by the original auricular chamber of the embryonic heart, while the remaining smooth portion is derived from the incorporation of the embryonic pulmonary vein in the atrial cavity. We will next consider the left ventricle. This denoted part is the left ventricular chamber. This is the left part of the ventricle. Also here, this is the left ventricular chamber, a transverse section. Now, as we noted earlier, the walls of this cavity, they are 3 times as thick as those of the right ventricle. We can see the thick wall in the left ventricle. This is the thickness of the wall in the left, and we're seeing a little thickness of the wall on the right. This is because the left ventricle will have larger surface area to pump blood to than the right ventricle that will pump blood only to the lungs. In a cross section, as we are having in this diagram, this is a cross section. This is a cross section. In this cross section, we'll see the cavity appearing circular. We can see the circular appearance of the left ventricular cavity. This is as a result of the bulging. The interventricular septum bulged into the right ventricle, giving the circular appearance of a transverse section of this chamber. In this image, we see the conical appearance of the entire chamber of the left ventricle. So the left ventricle is a little longer than the right ventricle. We'll next consider the interior of the cavity of the... Now this chamber has 2 orifices. We have the atrioventricular orifice, which is it's also called the bicuspid orifice or called the mitral orifice. Now in this diagram here, this is the left atrium and here is the left ventricle. Now we see the opening, and this opening is the bicuspid opening, and then we see a section of the valve which is said is called the atrioventricular or bicuspid or mitral. Now we see another opening of this chamber. Here is the opening, this is the opening here, this is the opening into arch of aorta. This interior also has 2 parts, as we noted in the right ventricle. What are these 2 parts? We have the upper smooth part and the lower rough part. Let's look at our next image. Here, this is the opening of the bicuspid. This is the left ventricular chamber. Now here is the opening into the aorta. Here is the opening into the aorta. This is part of the aortic valves. These are part of the aortic valves. Now we're talking about these two parts. We are seeing the upper smooth part here, and we're seeing the lower rough part here. Now this lower rough part here is the inflow part. Now this part going out here is the outflow part. So we're seeing a rough inflow part and we're seeing a smooth outflow part. The left ventricle has its upper part where it connects with the aorta, called the aortic vestibule. The aortic vestibule lies posterior to the infundibulum of the right ventricle. Now, when we discuss the right ventricle, we notice some of the muscle ridges called the trabecular canal. Now, the lower part has several muscle ridges. As we can see, a lot of them here. That's this lower part. You can see a lot of the muscle ridges here, which you already know what they are called, the trabecular canal. So this lower part will develop from the primitive ventricle of the heart tube. Now, the trabecular canal seen in this region are well developed, they are finer, and they are more numerous than those we saw when we discussed the right ventricle. We will consider the papillary muscles. Unlike in the right ventricle, where we saw 3 papillary muscles, here we'll be seeing 2 papillary muscles, and they are the anterior and the posterior muscles. So let's look at here. This is a left atrium, this is a left ventricle. Now this is the bicuspid opening. Now these are the valves, that's the anterior cusp, the posterior cusp. Now we're looking at the papillary muscles. We're having the anterior and then we're having the posterior. The anterior papillary muscle, like we noted, even in the right ventricle, is larger than the posterior papillary muscle. Both papillary muscles are connected by chordae tendineae to each valve. Here we can see, here in this diagram, we can see the anterior, we can see the posterior. Here is the papillary muscle, here is the chordae tendineae, and then these are the cusps. This is the papillary muscle. We'll consider the aortic valve. The aortic opening is guarded by the aortic valve. This valve is similar in structure to the pulmonary valve. In pulmonary valve, we saw 3 of them. We saw the right, the left, and the anterior. The aortic opening also has 3 valves, and they are semilunar cusps with free edge, each projecting upwards into the lumen of the ascending aorta. Here are the valves. These are the valves, the 3 of them. These are the valves. Now, between the semilunar cusps and the wall of the ascending aorta are pocket-like sinuses. These are named the right, the left, and the posterior. Now, these are sinuses. These are the sinuses in the valves. If we recall, we also noted pulmonary sinuses when we talked about the pulmonary valves. Now, if we also noted in the pulmonary valves, what we had the right and the left and anterior. Now, in the aortic valves, what we're having are the right, the left, and the posterior. Now, more understanding of the relationship between the pulmonary valve and aortic valve will be gotten in their embryology. And then I also recommend you look at our video on development of the heart, where we took time to explain this relationship. The right and left coronary arteries originate from the right and left aortic sinuses. Now, also in this view, we can see the right and left aortic sinuses, and then we can see the posterior aortic sinus. We notice the right and the left coronary arteries originating at the levels of these aortic sinuses, and then we can see there is no artery coming from the posterior aortic sinus. So as a result, the posterior aortic sinus and cusp are sometimes referred to as the non-coronary sinus and non-coronary cusp because they lack arteries coming out from them. The functioning of the aortic valve is similar to that of the pulmonary valve, with one important additional process. So this difference is that as blood recoils after ventricular contraction and fills the aortic sinuses, it will automatically be forced into the coronary arteries because these vessels originate from the right and left aortic sinuses. This is where we end this part of the lecture. If you have questions, comments, and suggestions, please drop them in the comment section. The part 3 of this lecture is on arterial blood supply to the heart and some clinical correlates associated with the heart. If you consider this material helpful, we encourage you to subscribe, like our video, and share it to your friends that it will also be helpful to. And together, we will build a unique anatomy family where we make anatomy simple. See you in my next video.